One of the songs our congregation loves was written in the year 1955 by a couple whose names were Jill Jackson Miller and Cy Miller. They wrote it for the International Children's Choir that's based in nearby Long Beach, California. The title, Let There Be Peace on Earth. It's not just the congregation who loves the song, I do as well. And I've been singing it for nearly 50 years now. And every time I sing it, I lose myself in those famous, beloved words. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Now, most times that I sing the song, I don't think much about the words. But this week, in preparing for the second week of Advent, when the theme is peace, I thought a great deal about those words. And in doing so, I realized something interesting. You see, when it comes to peace, I often think of the peacemakers as those who represent the other, as presidents, ambassadors, and diplomats. And during the season of Advent, of course, I think about the coming of this Prince of Peace, Jesus. And all of that is well and good, but I began to wonder this week, what would happen if I shook things up and thought about peace and those who make it a little bit differently? This week's gospel reading encourages us to do just that. For while the reading is, of course, about the one who came to prepare the way for another, the passage is about more than just John the Baptist and Jesus himself. It's about all of us and our journeys toward peace, too. How so? Well, listen as I read the passage this morning from Luke chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, and I'll be reading it from the Common English Bible. And when I finish, let's come back together and see how it might apply to our lives. In the 15th year of the rule of the Emperor Tiberius, when Pontius Pilate was governor over Judea and Herod was ruler over Galilee, his brother Philip was ruler over Iturea and Trachonitis, and Licinius was ruler over Abilene during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. God's word came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. John went throughout the region of the Jordan River, calling for people to be baptized, to show that they were changing their hearts and lives, and that they wanted God to forgive their sins. This was just as it was written in the scroll of the words of Isaiah the prophet, a voice crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way for the Lord, make his paths straight. Every valley will be filled, and every mountain and hill will be leveled. The crooked will be made straight, and the rough places made smooth. And all humanity will see God's salvation. And thus ends the sacred reading. Now, in order to find various ways in which that passage can inform our own understanding and experience of peace, I dug into it and pulled out 4 lessons that I believe can help us apply. Lesson number 1. Peace is best captured not through abstract cliches or platitudes, but rather in specific and concrete situations. As a child, I remember hearing passages like this morning's and wondering why they used so many big and unusual names. Names of those like Trachonitis and Licinius, as well as Caiaphas. The names were not only hard to pronounce, but hard to process. So most times when I read the passage, I would simply skim over them and not give those names a second thought. It really wasn't until I got older that I began to realize why those names were included. As Miriam Kamel wrote in her commentary, those names were included to let us know that that John the Baptist and Jesus weren't simply what she called mythical heroes. No, the use of those names remind us, she writes, that they existed in historical time and space and functioned within a specific historical context. And just as that Christ child came to a specific time and place back then, so too this year will that Christ child come within the specific confines and context of our own lives. Lesson 2. It is the ordinary, not the extraordinary, who end up paving the way for the Prince of Peace. In the list of names I mentioned a moment ago, there were indeed a lot of extraordinary people included. People like emperors, governors, and high priests even. And yet none of those people paved the way for the coming of the Prince of Peace. Instead, it was the one who scholar Kathy Beach Verhey called Simple John, the one who represented the epitome of an ordinary guy. Lesson number 3. The way is paved for the arrival of the Prince of Peace in those places of our lives that we least expect. Now, if you would have asked most folks of Jesus' time where news of the Christ child's coming would it be heralded, it would have said places like Rome, the center of the political empire, or even Jerusalem, the center of the religious establishment. Yet where was that proclamation made? In a nondescript place, referred to simply as the wilderness. And finally, lesson 4. The Prince of Peace appears after we have prepared the way or created room in our lives for his arrival. Each Advent, it's easy for us to passively sit back and watch the Christmas story unfold. But in today's reading, however, John the Baptist reminds us that we can't take a passive approach to his coming. No, in order to properly prepare to receive that Prince of Peace, John reminds us that we must actively participate by, and I quote from today's passage, by changing our hearts and our lives, and by showing God that we truly desire this thing called forgiveness. Valleys must be filled, mountains and hills level, and then we will be ready. So let's now put those 4 lessons together and see how they might look when placed in the context of our own lives today. And to do that, I'll use an example from my own experience to show how that Prince of Peace helped usher in a serenity and peace that had been so elusive to me over the first 4.5 decades of my life. Back in the year 2001, I had one of those life-changing moments when I met the person that I assumed I would spend the rest of my life with. And in one of those early, all-night-long conversations, he mentioned that he had battled for the most of his life this thing called chronic depression. Now, I had no firsthand experience of mental health issues. And so when he said chronic depression, I simply assumed that he meant he was occasionally depressed. And I remember thinking to myself, well, aren't we all? And with that, a 10-year relationship proceeded to unfold that would change my life forever. And as he and I created a home together, held a commitment ceremony, and started our careers, I began to realize that maybe I had not understood what he meant by depression. For as those crippling symptoms came, and occasionally even went. 1 year of symptoms stretched into another and another and another. And before I realized it, the first 6 years of our relationship had unfolded under the constant shadow of this depression. Boy, I had never experienced anything like it before. And as a natural caregiver, I did everything I could to try to fix his problem. And remember that, or I'll circle back to it later. But nothing that I tried worked. My partner resisted nearly every form of treatment that was offered, and with each passing day, I became a little more filled with things like despair, resentment, frustration, and anger. And as a pastor who was serving his first congregation at the time, I remember showing up for my folks each week, proclaiming those Advent messages of words like hope, peace, joy, and love. And yet, peace eluded me year after year after year. Things finally came to a head one day as he and I were talking of how we might spend a rare 3-day weekend together. I tossed out a few plans, and whatever I mentioned, he resisted, for he wanted to simply stay home and retreat from the world, as his depression so often encouraged him to do. And boy, in that moment, I had it. And in the midst of my complete frustration, I lashed out and I put my fist through a portion of the wall in our hallway. Now, my partner had come from a violent home, and he immediately insisted that I see an anger management counselor. Me? Get help? I remember thinking, I'm the victim here. I'm a pastor after all, and I've never had an issue with my anger with anyone else before. It's your fault, I said, or I don't have a problem. And yet I knew better. And so I gave in and went with his demand, and I saw the counselor. And over the course of the following days, years really, finally the peace of which the Christ child had promised came to be realized, largely through the 4 lessons I spoke of earlier. And let me show you how that worked. Lesson 1 taught me that my faith was indeed revealed in a specific time and place. And I was surprised to learn that it wasn't revealed in the sanctuary where I spend my Sunday mornings. No, it was through that experience of hitting a wall that I realized my real faith to that point had been in my own ability to hold things together, not in God. It was a painful lesson to learn. Lesson 2, that the one who is chosen in our lives to reveal the truth to us isn't often a trained professional. For me, the one chosen to pave that way was my partner, one who pushed me to the edge of my limits. Lesson number 3, and boy, this is where things started to get very real. You see, the peace that only that Christ child can bring didn't come in the place in my life that I expected. And when I say place, I don't mean a physical place like Rome or Jerusalem. No, I mean a place that was a part of my life. For you see, up until the moment when I hit the wall, I thought that all of my problems could be linked to the turbulent relationship that I was in. I thought that if I could just get my partner to establish a treatment program for his depression, that everything would be okay. And through the experience, I learned just how wrong I was. Which takes me to lesson 4. We must participate in the process of making room or space in our lives for the coming of this Prince of Peace. As I started those anger management courses, I began to realize that the problem was not with my partner and in his choices. No, my real problem was that I believed two things that almost killed me. Number one, I had believed that I was responsible for the well-being of others. And number two, I believed that I alone could fix them. And once I started addressing those issues head on, filling the valleys of despair and leveling out the mountain of ego, the world began to change little at a time. And as I let go of that illusion that I had power and control over things that were truly not mine, then I began to find peace. The peace that passes all understanding in ways I had never dreamed of. And while my relationship didn't survive, my friendship with my former partner did. And today, roughly 11 years after the breakup, my partner and I, or my ex and I, are still best of friends. And I offer that experience today, friends, to show us that the work of preparing for the Christ child didn't end with John's pronouncement in the desert over 2,000 years ago. Now, the work of preparing for the coming of that Christ child continues in our lives this very day. The preparations that we undertake will indeed take us to people and places that we would otherwise overlook or avoid. And the Advent preparations might change us forever. For that work will help us identify those things that keep us stuck in the turmoil and the drama of our lives. If we do that Advent preparation this year, it will help us let go on our journey as we embrace the peace that only that Christ child can bring. May we do the work that God has called us to do this Advent. Amen.